You'll see there's a scoring wheel at one end which resembles the scoring wheel we're familiar with in glass cutters like the Thomas grip, pencil grip, and pistol grip, because you don't want it to come in contact with the scoring blade just yet. Now at this point, you may be wondering, just how many bottles was I working with? But the process got easier the more comfortable I got with it, and I guess as we all know, that's how a lot of things go in life. Now, just because bottles break cleanly doesn't mean they don't have rough edges. And some might even have some minor nicks. So to smooth down these areas, I've got 3 methods to share. Let's get to it. Welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Julie, and on this channel we talk about tips, tricks, tools, adhesives, materials, and specific mosaic projects, all to shorten your learning curve when it comes to creating mosaic art. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. Bottles are such fun mosaic substrates. They're a solid surface which makes them an acceptable substrate for mosaics as well. Plus they're easy to find and many of them have really cool, unique shapes. If you use a clear bottle and we're planning to incorporate transparent or semi-transparent glass, then that adds an additional wow factor when it's in bright light. You could mosaic on a whole bottle, meaning it's uncut or unmodified, or you can do like what we're going to do today and break down the bottle to create a new substrate for something totally different. Now I'm doing this video today because it's been a recurring request in the comments of my videos here on my channel. And if you watched my last video about finding mosaic tesserae and substrates at your local grocery store, then you know I shared lots of things which can be modified, like what we're doing in today's video. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll include a link to it down below in the description so you can check it out. You can access this information if you're watching on your desktop computer by clicking more under the video description. And if you're watching on your tablet or your smartphone, you can click more to the right of the video title. Truth be told, before a week ago, I had never done this before. Now, of course, I've broken bottles and such that have already been previously broken down because they were banged or smashed or whatever. But I had never actually done this process before. Keep that in mind as you're going through this. Give yourself grace. It's a process. It's a learning curve. None of us start out as experts, right? But I've never cut down a bottle with the intention of keeping the bottle shape intact and just separating it into 2 pieces. So this was new to me, and yeah, I was a little nervous. But the process got easier the more comfortable I got with it, and I guess as we all know, that's how a lot of things go in life. So in today's video, I'll show you how to set up a bottle cutter, how to score a glass bottle, how to break the bottle along the score line, and 3 different ways to smooth the rough edges. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Before we can get started with scoring the bottles, we first have to remove all of the labels. And just as we know with the variety of mosaic adhesives available, there are also a variety of bottle adhesives for the labels. So, I soaked these bottles for a number of hours, and some labels came off with little to no effort, and others involved lots of effort using a straight edge razor blade. There was one bottle's label that was so frustrating it was not budging, it did not want to come off, so I put that bottle straight in the recycling bin and moved on. So you want to soak off the labels, especially where you'll be running the scoring wheel over it, and you'll see what I mean a little later in the video. Once you've got the labels removed, make sure you allow at least the outside of the bottles to be fully dry before moving on to the next step. And now that the bottles are dry and label-free, we're able to get started with scoring the bottles. But before we begin scoring, this is an important safety note. Make sure you wear eye protection at all times during each step of the process. You are dealing with glass, you're dealing with some extreme temperatures, and things can happen. Here's the bottle cutter I purchased. I really liked it and thought it was easy to work with, and I'll link it down below in the description in case you're interested. Included with the bottle cutter is a pair of gloves, a pencil grip, glass cutter, and sandpaper. To get the cutter set up, unscrew the knob screw and put the L bracket in one direction or the other depending on the size of the bottles you're going to score. You'll see there's a scoring wheel at one end which resembles the scoring wheel we're familiar with in glass cutters like the Thomas grip, pencil grip, and pistol grip. You'll also see there are a number of plastic wheels, and these will support your bottle and allow you to easily turn your bottle while you're scoring it. Now that we're set up, it's time to actually score some bottles. So to get started, you want to put the bottom of your bottle against the L bracket at the back of the cutter without laying it down, because you don't want it to come in contact with the scoring blade just yet. And then once the bottle is pressed up against the L bracket, you can lay the bottle down, but don't move it or roll it side to side until you're ready to start scoring. Now to score the bottle, I rolled it away from me while also applying a little bit of pressure. And as you roll the bottle, you'll hear the wheel scoring the surface of the glass, just like when you score a piece of stained glass. This here is my first practice bottle. And I would suggest that you have a few practice bottles just so you can get acquainted and accustomed to how things go. And before I move on with any of the others, I first want to make sure I'm scoring correctly and applying enough pressure. I want to make sure the bottle is scored completely all the way around. This is very important. So the next step is to heat up the bottle and then manually cool it down quickly. So as a quick setup for my practice bottle, I put a towel in my kitchen sink and poured hot water over the score line. Now we're just focused on the score line right now. And then while the bottle is still hot, I poured ice cold water over the score line. This is a process, so be patient and go slow. The score line didn't break exactly where I wanted it to or how I wanted it to, so I'm glad I didn't start with my favorite bottle. But I do see how this works, and I'll make a couple adjustments moving forward. So I went back in the studio and got to work on scoring more bottles. And as I mentioned, I made a few adjustments along the way. So this time I went a little slower with the scoring, which not only helped in the scoring wheel not jumping, but also it helped me keep the bottle pushed back and pressed against the L bracket. Another thing I did as I adjusted my hands, I tried to keep one hand on the bottle while the other adjusted its position, and I did this carefully and slowly so that the bottle didn't move and cause additional scoring that wasn't in the same direction I was already scoring in. It's important to note that you want the scoring wheel to make contact with the bottle surface while the bottom of the bottle is pushed up against the L bracket. So what I mean by this is you want the scoring wheel to make contact with the bottle a little further down, not on the neck of the bottle. The scoring wheel cannot make contact with the neck of the bottle if the bottom of the bottle is pushed against the L bracket. It's simply not possible because the scoring wheel is pretty much at the same level as those little wheels that are helping you roll the bottle easily. Otherwise, you'll be moving the bottle around just to make contact with the scoring wheel, and then the bottle will no longer be pressed up against the L bracket. And as a result, your score line will be all over the place and most likely won't break the way you want it to. So for the best, cleanest break, you want the score line to start and stop in the same place. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in scoring and cutting glass bottles, I'll include a link to the bottle cutter I'm using down below in the description in case you're interested. When you've placed your bottle on the cutter, make sure the scoring wheel isn't in line with any raised lettering or graphics or whatever that might be on the glass surface. If you do, the scoring wheel will jump as you go over these raised letters and features on the glass surface. And when the scoring wheel jumps, it's no longer scoring the glass in a continuous line anymore, which isn't what you want. You want a continuous score line. What you're doing by making a score line all the way around the bottle is you're breaking the tension on the surface of the glass. It's the same thing as when we run a cutter over the surface of a piece of stained glass. Only this time, we don't have the benefit of breaking the score line of the bottle with running pliers. That's where the extreme temperatures come in, and we'll get to that in a minute. So when scoring bottles, make sure the outside is thoroughly dry to keep your hands from slipping. And speaking of slipping, you don't want to have lotion on your hands when scoring the bottles. You need to be able to grip the bottle and have full control of rolling it on the wheels. Now, I did score a couple of Starbucks Frappuccino bottles, which are squarish, and those scored well. I just went really slow, especially when rounding the corners. Whew, that was a lot of scoring. And for those of you who have been here for a little while, you know that I injured my wrist in 2023. And I will say that this scoring process of having to keep a little bit of pressure on the bottle while rolling it on the cutter, it did aggravate or cause some soreness in my wrist that I had injured. But after a couple hours, I was fine. So I just wanted to mention that in case you have wrist issues or maybe even some finger issues where, you know, maybe you've got a trigger finger or whatever. I just wanted you to be aware that it does take, you know, a little bit of, I don't even want to say coordination. It does take a little bit of coordination because you do want to keep a hand on the bottle, you know, just so things don't slip. But it also does take a little bit of pressure while rolling, and it can aggravate your wrists a little bit or your fingers. So I just wanted you to be aware of what I experienced. Now that all of the bottles are scored, it's time to move on to the next step, which is applying extreme hot and extreme cold to the score line so that we can shock the you-know-what out of these bottles. I was working with a lot of bottles, so I needed a bigger setup because it was going to take me a few sessions to get through all of them. And from session 1 to session 2, I made a few adjustments which we'll talk about in a little bit. I got started by putting a stock pot of water on the cooktop and turned it up to high. Now I need the water in the pot to get up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And as this was heating up, I made a bowl of ice water. Now remember, we need both temperature extremes to shock the glass and score line, which ultimately will break the bottle into 2 parts. If you aren't working with a lot of bottles, then you can probably get away with the setup I did for my practice bottle, where I put that towel in the kitchen sink and poured hot water over it and then the ice cold water over it. But because I'm dealing with a large number of bottles, this setup will keep the water hot enough for me for as long as I need it. And once the hot water was ready, I started dipping the bottles in the stock pot for about 15 to 20 seconds. And then I immediately put the hot bottle into the cold water again for 15 to 20 seconds. Now, sometimes it took a couple tries. Sometimes I would hear the glass crack while in the cold water, but it wasn't enough to fully break the bottle. So I'd put the bottle back in the hot water, which usually did the trick. Now, of course, it's not ideal because it would be much easier to fish out the top or the bottom of the bottle from the ice cold water rather than the super hot water. But sometimes it took even more times of back and forth between the hot water, hot water, back to the cold water before the score line would break. Now, the thicker walled bottles were harder to break and definitely took longer and more tries. My first day of doing this was a little frustrating because I realized the ice water started to get warmer, but I had run out of ice cubes. So the temperature of the water was no longer, quote, shocking to the hot bottles. But on day 2, I made some adjustments, such as making sure I had a ton of ice so I could keep the cold water cold the entire time that I was working. And to fish things out of the hot water, I used a silicone pot holder as well as a long arm skimmer strainer. Now, personally, I think a spider strainer would work even better, but I didn't have one of those. If the bottle was taking more time to break and I had to go from hot to cold and back to hot again, I used the silicone pot holder under the bottle just to make sure it didn't break while I was transferring it from the cold pot over to the hot pot. Now at this point, you may be wondering, just how many bottles was I working with? I had over 40 of them to break, actually, and clearly I had been collecting for a while. And you might be thinking, wow, Julie is quite the party girl. Nope, quite the contrary. I haven't been a drinker for a while, so the majority of these aren't mine except for the Kavita probiotics drink and the Starbucks bottles. Now my suggestion to you would be to start collecting bottles of different sizes. So we're talking about beer bottles, wine, spirits, basically anything that's glass. You could even try some glass bottles such as, things that olives come in, or sometimes you can get the fancy carrots that come in a glass jar. Experiment. Again, watch my last video that talks about substrates and tesserae that you can find at the grocery store. That might give you some idea of what's available out there, especially when you go on your next grocery trip. You can actually look at the shelves and think, which of these could I break down once I've consumed what's inside? And you want to make sure you have a few practice bottles before you attempt to cut your most favorite pieces. And as you can see, I've got clear and colored glass bottles. And I felt the clear versus the colored glass didn't affect how well or how difficult they were to break. It really came down to how thick the glass walls are. Okay, now that all of the glass bottles are broken, it's time to inspect them to see what needs to be done. Some of the bottles didn't break well, but are still salvageable and will need some work. So I used my wheeled glass nippers to take care of any glass that didn't completely break. So I positioned the wheel in the score line and nipped the glass. Now sometimes the pieces broke off with hardly any pressure at all from the nippers. And once all of the nipping was done, it was time to inspect the edges to see what needed to be smoothed over. Now just because bottles break cleanly doesn't mean they don't have rough edges. And some might even have some minor nicks. So to smooth down these areas, I've got 3 methods to share. The first method is to use the sandpaper which came with the glass cutter. I found that this worked well for very minor rough edges. And I rubbed the cut bottle back and forth and in half circle motions over the surface of the sandpaper until the bottle rim felt smooth. You want to be careful though when you rub your fingers over the glass rim surface when checking to see if it's smooth or not. Remember, this is rough cut glass and yeah, you're going to get cut if you're not careful. So the second method is with this small metal file with a fine grit. It also did a good job with smoothing down rough edges, but again, just like with the sandpaper, I found this worked well for minor rough edges. However, I used it after I used the next method, and it worked really well to make fine-tune adjustments. The third method, and definitely my favorite, is to use an electric glass grinder. Now I've got a fine grit bit on my grinder, and I got to work with running the bottle rims over the grinder. You want to pay close attention when doing this. Be fully focused on the task that you're doing. And I say this because you want to avoid the glass bottle touching the grinder bit other than the grit area of the bit. Take your time and make sure you go over the entire surface of the rim. And I say this because if you don't go over the entire surface of the bottle rim, some areas will look glossy and some areas will look scratched up from the grinder. And if you put your substrate, whatever you're going to turn this item into, if you put it in a place where it's going to be sitting somewhere and the rim is going to be visible to, people who are around it, you want the entire bottle opening or the rim to look uniform. And because I was working with so many bottles, the electric grinder certainly sped things up for me. So once I was done grinding all of the bottles, I went back over to my work table and used the small metal file to make a few fine-tune adjustments. So things that I did with this is I sort of rounded out the outside of the rim just slightly so that it just wasn't sharp. And I did the same thing on the inside of the rim as well. This is super important if you intend to turn these glass bottle bottoms into, let's say, a drinking glass. You're definitely going to want to make sure that everything is smooth on that rim surface. You may be wondering, I only cleaned up the clear bottles and I didn't do anything with the colored bottles. Well, I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on what I do with those, as well as what I'm going to do with the clear bottoms that we just cleaned up. Again, all items in this video are listed down below in the description in case you'd like to cut some bottles of your own. Ow. Imagine that, a piece of glass on my work table. Who would have thought? So if that's... Shoot, there is so much glass up here. I broke a bottle right before I started filming. Whatever. How are we feeling? How are we feeling? Are we gonna be cutting some bottles? It was not intentional, but I've got little shards all over. Do you remember the video where I cut circles or holes through the rims of plates? This was just as addicting, and you might also find it pretty addicting, which is why you want to start collecting glass bottles. Oh, I missed this. Yeah, you want to start collecting. I've now got to reprogram my brain that I'm not collecting bottles anymore. You know what? I might keep collecting some unusual bottles. Some of them are like really heavy, nice glass. But let's just say everybody on my Christmas list this year is getting some sort of mosaic from the bottom of a bottle. I cannot wait for the next couple of videos. So anyways, I love you. I'll see you soon. For more mosaic inspiration, check out one of these two videos. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon. Bye.